Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the ABT Time podcast. This, I believe, is episode number 42, and I'm going to try and speak softly here in this session today because I have got a recuperating patient sitting here on the couch next to me. Give you a little glance here at her name is Eva, the half husky, half German shepherd, a little over a year old, who got her spay operation yesterday and brought her home last night, and she's a little zonked out on the couch with the cone around her neck. That's what happens, but she's doing just fine. But as a result, I'm going to try and talk softly in this episode. But we got lots to dive into, and this is going to be a special episode focusing on our long-term partnership with the National Park Service. So for over 10 years, I've been working with the NPS folks, and we got special guest will be joining us in about 10 minutes or so. Cari Kreshak, who's head of training for National Park Service, who's been really a superstar in working with our ABT program. But before I bring her on, I want to give you some of the background of this great partnership that we've had with the National Park Service that began for me a little over 10 years ago. And one of my great buddies from back in the science world, back when we were graduate students together, over 40 years ago, G-Minis, at Harvard University in both studying evolutionary biology, Kurt Fristrup. And he, his expertise was in sound. He worked on bird songs and bird communication in rainforests mostly, and eventually worked on marine mammals as well. And found his way eventually to the National Park Service based in Fort Collins, Colorado. I think he was head of their Night Skies program for a long time. And about 10 years ago, brought me in for a first kind of introductory experience, 10, maybe 11 years ago, with an event. They do their annual event in like September called their All Hands Day, where they bring in everybody from kind of the region. There were a lot of people from Yellowstone and I think even Yosemite and all through Colorado, probably 200 or 300 people there. And at lunchtime that day, they had me give a talk. And that was just at the very beginning of discovering the ABT. In fact, that first workshop was before I'd even seen the South Park clip that began the whole formulation of the ABT. But that went so well that they brought us back a few months later, brought me back to do a full workshop there in Fort Collins with all of them. And I brought with me two co-instructors, Brian Palermo, my improv guy. That was right at the beginning of our collaboration. He's still working with our ABT Framework course, and also Dory Barton, who's an expert in narrative structure, who really taught me a lot of the stuff that I use nowadays. She kind of introduced me to the deeper dimensions of Joseph Campbell. And we had a tremendous 2-day workshop there with the folks. I think we did it at the Hilton Hotel there in Fort Collins, but with all the National Park Service folks. One of the cool little follow-ups of that visit was about 2 years later. I remember talking to Kurt, and he told me about how big of an impact Brian's improv training had with them. And he'd only done, just a few little workshop sessions with them, but taught them all, introduced them. This is back when, nobody really was thinking much about improv in science communication. And he taught them about the basic principle of yes and, the idea of affirmation. And Kurt said to me like 2 years later, you wouldn't believe how many times in meetings we have in conference rooms where we're working some committee, and you get a bunch of scientists together and they're all trained in negation. And unfortunately, the downside of that is sometimes a group of scientists can begin to negate something, an idea, and they can just dismantle it, take it to pieces, and you end up with the whole thing destroyed. And everybody's proud of themselves for punching holes in it, but that didn't really help things overall. So those things can spin out of control. And what Kurt had said was, you wouldn't believe how many times in the past couple of years we'd be in one of those downward spirals, and somebody in the room would say, hey, remember that thing that Brian taught us about yes and? Let's give that a shot right now. And he said it was like a plane that was, spiraling down towards crashing in the ground, and suddenly starts to pull up with a little bit of positivity. And next thing you know, you're back on putting together something constructive. I always thought that was a great application of the whole improv, the affirmation dynamic that's so important. In 2016, we did a demo day there for our Story Circles training program back in Fort Collins again. And that demo day was with 3 groups, with Fish and Wildlife, with USGS, and with USDA. It wasn't with National Park Service, but there was a fellow there, Larry Perez, with the National Park Service, who's I think head of the climate program, at least for that region, who got in touch with me and asked if he could meet with us and talk about what we were doing with Story Circles. And Mike Strauss, Rick Nelson, and I met with him in the lobby and had a short chat with him. And it's so funny because we were so busy and we thought, I don't think that's going to amount to anything. And he kind of begged us and said, I think I can get the funding for this stuff. You got to be patient. You got to wait. It's going to take a while. And so we forgot all about him, and he kept checking in every few months. And lo and behold, about a year later, he found the funding, and it was tremendous. What Larry Perez did for kind of jumpstarting our Story Circles training was very important, because he found funding for 6 circles all at once. And so we came back about a year later and we launched 6 Story Circles at once of 5 people each. So that was like 30 people all at once. That was kind of our first real scaling up of the narrative training. And those circles went great. We made a 5-minute video out of that helped further kind of convey the concept of what we were doing with Story Circles training. And at the same time, Marcy Rockman was working with National Park Service, and she put out a 50-page report on archaeology in the National Park Service. And she, in that report, used the ABT as a template for all the case studies, and even had a 1-page description of what the ABT is and how to use it. That was also another huge help. All these folks who were early adopters, someday we're going to put together the ABT Hall of Fame, and they will all have little panels there in the Hall of Fame of them throwing in their credibility behind this kind of juggernaut now that we've built up over the course of a decade. It's taken a long time. There's been a lot of people that have just scoffed and said ABT, that's too simple, yada yada. No, actually, it's really booming now. Just as a side note, this fall we're going to be running it. I'm going to be going to Nepal in September for 2 weeks to train the heads of their global sectors in the ABT framework, and to do a whole bunch of work with their Southeast region. We're running the course with Genentech and Georgia Medical Schools and NOAA and FAA. So it's really spreading widely now. But we're eternally thankful for these early adopters that jumped in. And so we ran Story Circles for a while, and then the pandemic hit, and Story Circles was built around the idea of doing everything in person, especially the demo day that launched it. And we go to a location, have 40 people in a room for a day for the demo day. They all get kind of oriented, and then they go off and make their own circles of 5 each that would meet for the 10 1-hour sessions. And so all that was booming in the beginning of 2020. The pandemic hit. We had to shut down all travel, everything like that, like everybody else. We kind of sat around in disarray for a month or two. And then the Zoom world opened up, and that was the beginning of our shifting gears into the ABT Framework course. We ran the course twice, open for anybody to sign up, and filled 2 rounds of that with 50 people each. Then the third time we ran it with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the fourth time that we ran it, so it was going month by month. For the 4th round, I was contacted by Cari Kreshak and from National Park Service. And that was the beginning of what's turned out to be a very productive partnership that we've had. And so on that note, Cari, how's about if you join me and we can get started talking about this great partnership? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to see you, Randy.
Good to see you. And I'll let you say hi to Eva here, sleeping on the couch.
Hi, Eva. I hope you feel better soon.
She's working on it. And let's see, you've been based in DC for a long time. How about give us a little bit of, for starters, your background, how you got into this position with National Park Service that you're doing with national training. So take us from the very start. What was your undergraduate work in, things like that?
Sure. So I've been with the Park Service for, 21 years now. My background is in archaeology. My formal training is as an archaeologist, and I started working in national parks, managing cultural resources programs and their cultural resources at the park level.
Did you do a degree in archaeology?
Yeah, I have a master's in archaeology.
Where'd you do that?
Western Washington University in Bellingham.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah, I went to UW and I had a lot of friends up there. What did you do actual archaeology field work back in doing that degree?
I did, although I was fortunate enough to sort of start doing some summer work for the Forest Service and some other federal agencies just in the summer to kind of pay my bills, and fell in love with it because managing federal lands and cultural resources on federal lands is kind of a cool job, right? I get to wander around in the forest or the desert or wherever it is, and I was thinking to myself, like, this is a job and I could get paid to do this. This is pretty cool. So that's kind of
Wow.
how it all started.
So you were already pre-programmed for the National Park Service before you ever even got there.
I think so. I mean, I love being outdoors, and it really is an awesome job. So it kind of started there, and from there I worked in parks, I worked in regional offices, worked in various places around the country managing cultural resources programs. Sort of haphazardly fell into the training world. Started helping as a subject matter expert to develop some training, and just kind of kept doing it, and found myself in this position managing the training program for natural and cultural resources in the National Park Service at the national level. And I've been doing this for about 7 years now, and really enjoy it. I mean, I'm able to take my field experience and my understanding of what people in the field need, and apply that to the training world. And so I feel like it brings an added benefit, right? I know what people need. I've been there. So I'm bringing that perspective of, what do the folks in the field really need?
What are some of the main training programs from the start when you first began working there with NPS? Like, what would you do for training people?
A lot of what we do focuses on the laws and policies that we uphold as federal land managers. So, I mean, it sounds like it's a little bit boring, and sometimes it is, but it's it's what we do, right? I mean, we're protecting and preserving resources, so we have to understand the laws. So that's a lot. That's a lot of it, is helping our employees understand, how to be a federal land manager. I mean, we've got biologists, we've got archaeologists, we've got a lot of ologists, and they're coming in with their formal degrees. I don't have to train biologists how to do biology, right? But they do need to understand how to be a federal employee. So, how do you operate as a federal employee? How do you manage the laws and compliance that we need to uphold? How do you communicate better? All those things that you don't necessarily learn in your formal college or formal, training.
Mm-hmm. Aside from our ABT Framework course, have you guys had basic communications training programs? I mean, I think I talked with one of the guys. It was like a separate company that you guys hired that came in and explained, was it NEPA or one of those big chunks of policy that you guys have to enforce, whatever. And he told me about that stuff. But what they did was not really communications training. Have you had traditionally basic communications training? What sort was it you did it?
I think off and on there probably has been some communication training. I'm not familiar with a lot of them because I feel like they're sort of come and go, and we try different things and they're not successful, and so they sort of just fade off in the middle of the night. We do, I will say, and the Park Service has been around for over 100 years now, but
right.
And I've only been with them for 20, but I feel like for the 100 years that we've been an agency, the one thing people have always floated to the top when they're talking about what they can do better or what they need more of is better communication. We hear it all the time whenever we do surveys, whenever we ask employees, like, what is their biggest concern? What is their biggest beef, basically, is the poor communication internally and externally. I mean, we are America's storyteller in the National Park Service.
Actually, let's slow that down a little bit to that divide.
Sure.
So internally, you're talking about between different departments within National Park Service, and tell me a little bit about that problem.
Yeah, so we're siloed essentially. We have a lot of different divisions: natural resources, cultural resources, law enforcement, visitor uses, administration. So, like any agency that happens, we kind of get divided up. And so, theoretically, we should be communicating very well across those divisions, but we don't all the time, and we don't most of the time. So we even struggle internally with communicating. We're also spread across the country, right? So we have people all the way down to American Samoa, Puerto Rico, up to Maine, Alaska. So people are all over the place. And so that alone kind of impedes some of the communication. We're kind of disconnected that way. So that is usually people's biggest complaint about, leadership on down, that they're just not hearing things, or they don't get the message. They're not connected.
Let me ask you, if there's widespread agreement, that is a problem. Is there widespread agreement on a solution to it?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I think people have tried different things, but it's a tricky one, as you know. I mean, it's hard to get all those folks on the same page.
Yeah. I think one of our longer term goals is to sort of get a broader understanding of the power of the ABT to address that problem of silos, that when you can bring people together from 5 completely different programs and they have nothing in common for content because they all work on different whole areas. And yet when you start working on the same basic form of ABT, they instantly have that in common, and they can work together as groups shaping ABTs, and they can critique them equally. That's what we're just slowly but surely learning. And actually, we're going to talk in a few minutes about the narrative gym that we're about to launch next week. And I'll go into that in some detail, but that's exactly what people will be seeing with that exercise. Okay, so that was about the internal communication. Now let's talk about the external communication, and tell us about the challenges there.
Yeah, that's probably what we're better known for in the Park Service, is communicating out to the public. I mean, we have our interpretive staff who are doing presentations. Obviously, we have a big presence on social media now. We have signage, we have brochures, we have information that we're trying to get out to the public and to our park visitors. And I think in general, we do a pretty good job of that.
What was the one project, or it was your marketing program that came in? What was it? Choose Your Park or something like that? Or what was that campaign?
Find Your Park. Yeah, that was in 2016 for the centennial celebration. Of
Tell us about that.
I don't know a whole lot about that. I think it was successful. I don't know how you measure success for that, but I think people are finding their parks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's certainly, especially with COVID, and people are sort of flooding our national parks, which is both good and bad. I mean, it's fantastic to have people loving our parks, but in some ways they're being loved to death. So it's even more important that our messaging and our communication is reaching the people that it needs to reach effectively. So it's a big lift for our employees to get the messages out that people will understand or connect with.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you come across our ABT course?
I kind of inherited it from a person who was in the position prior to me, but then I think we were obligated to offer the course with you. So I was like, okay, sounds good, I'll do it. And then I was hooked. I mean, at first it was just sort of like an obligation, like, oh yeah, I guess I have to do this because we bought it. But once I sat through the class and I saw the reactions and sort of the energy around this, I thought this is a good tool. It's simple but complex, right? I mean, it's something that someone can learn. You obviously have to practice it, and sort of exercise that muscle. But it's I felt like it's something the National Park Service could really grab onto. We're all so busy. Everybody's busy. This is some concept that can easily be understood and applied across the board. I mean, we've just been talking about, we have a lot of internal communication, lots of external communication. We've got partners at, political partners.
Can you think of any specific examples you've seen people using the ABT?
Yes, there's a group of climate change folks who are providing training and guidance on how to manage climate change, but also message climate change. And they're actually bringing people into training and using the ABT to help people message around climate change. And they're actually like doing it, right? They're making them write ABT statements. It's not just talking about, oh, here's one tool you could use. I mean, they're actually using it. And so it's getting a bigger audience across the National Park Service. And I think that's fantastic. And then they all post their ABTs, in an online forum where people can read and share their ideas. So that's one example. I'm trying to think of some other.
It'd be nice if I knew about that. I knew nothing about that. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, there's good stuff. There's a lot of things that go on that I don't even know about, or I just hear about randomly. But
that's really good. You know what? As a side note, let's try and get a few of those people to tune in on the Narrative Gym in the next month. As I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll lay it out clearly, but that's exactly the thing. The next step for people like that is to get them to understand that we're now at the point where we talk more and more about the primary and secondary levels of the ABT. So the primary is just the 3 words and, but, therefore, and with that alone, you can already make your ABT. And then the secondary is all the stuff that you've listened to in the last 2 years, is the if then statement, the but, because clause, the how, what, dynamic, all these secondary things that are at a finer scale that make it that much more powerful. And I think that's what we've managed to evolve in the course, is discovering that secondary layer. We of course had the primary layer when we got started, but now it's really, we now kind of begin the course by talking about, here's what you can all get in the first session, and but therefore the next 10 sessions are going to be all of these finer scale details that really help you master it. That's cool. Yeah, keep going. You had some other.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call park speak.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see when I talk to people, or when we listen to people talk in the Park Service, especially at the leadership level, but all the way down to the field, there's a way that people start to communicate where it's I call it fluff too. It's really fluff. I mean, there's these, we talk about preserving and protecting for future generations and on and on and on, right? So, and all that's good stuff, right? I mean, that's what we do. That's what we're all about. I mean, the meaning behind all of that is very valuable and important. But we've turned it into something that's so.
Wait. Now you just landed on ABT structure right there. But well done.
We've turned it into something that it's become meaningless because it's so, we say it over and over, and it's lost its impact.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's a really strong need to help those people who are presenting that information, that valuable, important information, in a way that connects with people. And I think we've lost that connection because it's just turned into what I call this fluffy park speak.
You know what? So let me toss this out there, because we're constantly evolving in how we're doing this thing. We're constantly thinking, especially Matt and I, he's become the co-brain of the operation. We have these long discussions, and Mike Strauss and a few other folks as well. But right now we finished 25 rounds of the course in the spring. If I had the whole summer off, which is always great because it's time for us to just think and talk and process when we get going running the course, it's all kind of moving along at blinding speed, and we can't think quite so much to modify anything. But when we get these breaks, we can synthesize. And what's coming in the new rounds, of course, is the first session is now going to focus on what I'm calling first principles of the ABT framework. And there are 3 first principles, the first of which is verbal before written. What we've learned through experience is that as soon as you start writing your ABT, you start complicating it. When people speak, they tend to be more drawn to simplicity. And we have this over and over again. And when we used to do the demo days, somebody would read a very convoluted ABT, and I would say, what's the main problem? They'd look up and say, we're running out of funds. And the whole room would explode. Like, well, now we get it. You use 83 words to tell us one little basic problem, which is we're running out of funds. And you don't want to obscure your problem by having too much stuff like that. And so that's kind of our first principle. But the second principle is this quote from this guy from Silicon Valley in the business world. He was on Park Howell's podcast, our guy in the business world. And they were talking about the ABT, and his name's Christopher Lochhead. And what he said is he loves to use foul language, but he basically said, nobody buys a solution without an effing problem. And that was a simple little quote, but it's the last 6 months, it's resonated deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And it applies exactly what you're talking about right there, which is you get these spokespeople that are proudly telling the crowd about their solutions, but the crowd doesn't have a problem. and nobody buys a solution without a problem. You've got to find ways to light up the brains of your audience with a problem first, and that's the whole idea of the ABT is first, let's sketch out a problem that everybody can relate to. And ideally you present it to them where you're almost asking their help. Here at NPS, we face this problem. How do you get people to do this, this, and this? And let them soak that in and let them think about it. And then you finally say, and the way that we're doing that is we're doing this to address that problem. But as soon as you start to lose that basic understanding, nobody buys a solution without a problem. That is so fundamental. And it's what's bypassed over and over again. We talk about, you probably heard that one lecture we give about North Dakota, Rick Nelson telling about how the conservation groups there put together this giant solution for all the conservation problems. They just forgot to verify that there actually was a problem for the state. And when they brought me in afterwards, I went around state and found out that 80% of the people there felt there's no problems in conservation. We've got so many birds and deer and everything overrunning the state. Why would we spend more money? And so nobody buys a solution without a problem. And I think that's going to be part of our new agenda this fall, is trying to propagate that fundamental understanding at the broadest of all levels, that before you get going, telling everybody proudly about all your solutions, you kind of want to activate their brains with what the problem was. Does that make any sense in terms of that?
It does. It does. It makes me think about those of us living in the West and the fires. Mm-hmm. And, messaging around that. I mean, our friend Christy Brigham at Sequoia and Kings Canyon,
yes,
having to talk about a very complex tree, the giant sequoia, and what that means to our ecosystem, and what that means when those forests burn up. I mean, explaining that to the general public, I mean, people can understand it if they listen to it, but there's got to be a better way, to get those messages out. And we've got a huge problem that we need to address.
And that's the problem is the problem, and appreciating that you can't bypass the problem and just go right to solutions. And people are, and I don't know, it goes on and on, the sources of that. But that's a perfect segue. Christy, who will be one of your two presenters for the Narrative Gym. So let me say a few words about the Narrative Gym. We can talk about how that's going to be fun and relevant. So we, last spring, one of the last rounds we ran the course was with Pfizer, their global medical epidemiology group. They jumped in a big way, and we had about 15 people in that group, and we got halfway through it, and the head guy said, we're getting so much out of this, it can't stop. We need to do a ABT 2.0. And Matt and I began brainstorming, and first thing we thought was, well, we've got these standard 10 1-hour sessions, but we don't want to give 10 more lectures. There's not that much more to, that's the beauty of it all, is that, it's fairly simple. And then what began to dawn on us was that the 2.0 version needed to be the Narrative Gym. We'd already written the book with that title and developed this concept of you need to go to the gym narratively and keep working out week after week after week. And so that's what we brought back to them, was this idea of, once we finish the 10 1-hour sessions and everybody's kind of got the basics, then let's jump into the second round, in which there's no more lectures, no more teaching, that sort of stuff. It's now each week, the Narrative Gym, in which everybody, all 15 people, and plus they have 5 to 10 other observers that are joining in, gather for, in their case, just 1 hour, and each week, and they bought in for 12 sessions. So today, in a couple hours, I will be doing the 12th and final session with them. It's gone wonderfully. And what each session consists of is one of their people is the presenter. That person gives a 3-minute presentation with only 3 slides. I work with that person the day before to kind of shape it up, and it's just basically the raw material for their basic ABT. They run through their 3 slides there in the beginning, 3 minutes. Then I moderate the discussion for a half an hour, and everybody else is what we call the builders. Those are all the people that have taken the course. They know the basic ABT elements. And so we start in the discussion, and the discussion has 5 parts to it. And we go through the same progression. We've done this, for 12 weeks now. And the 5 parts are, first off, what's the problem? That's what our model in the book, is really converged on. You always begin with, what is the problem here? If you don't, and again, that Christopher Lockhead, nobody buys a solution without a problem. You've got to really start with what your problem is, getting that super clear. And actually what you find is, once you get that locked in, if you take a lot of time to get that organized, then most of the other parts kind of fall out of it. But the first element is, what is the problem? Then once we get that locked in, we go on to the second one, which is, what's the ordinary world? How are you going to start this your ABT off. Third one is what's at stake, using the if then quite often. And then the fourth one is the conversational ABT. Let's strip this thing down into a simple little, we've got something good, but we're not doing it as well as we could be. Therefore, we got to do a better job. Simple little stories like that. And then the fifth and final element is the Dobzhansky, nothing in whatever this topic is, drug development makes sense except in the light of blank. And that's always the final elements. And it's kind of fun because for that last one, you just have everybody take their shot in the chat room and type in one word. And then the other cool thing we've added to it is that we have one person who's what we call the scribe. And that person does the screen sharing and they put word up on the screen. And so as everybody's kind of spitballing their different ideas and things, this person is typing it all in, everything that seems like a note. And you end up with 5 to 7 pages of notes by the end of the half-hour session. And that's what the person gets to take away as a document is here's 5 to 7 pages of thoughts and ideas on your narrative. And then with each of those 5 things, the basic procedure is you let the whole group go at it, kind of brainstorming. And then once we're done listing up there 5 or 6 or 7 people's shots at what they think the problem is, then you bring the presenter on and that person looks at them all and kind of synthesizes and says, yeah, I think I'll take this piece and that piece from the different ones and come up with one. You don't end up with a perfect ABT, but you just, it's really, we put this together out of our own instincts. And once it was together, Matt and I looked at it and said, you know what, all we're doing is the same thing they do in Hollywood in writers' rooms. They have people in a room for, all day long doing the same basic process, working on the episode, shaping the narrative of it. The story's going to go here, there, just basic ABT type stuff. As I say, we've done 11 sessions. Today will be the 12th. And each one is just really great. You just end up with, and it's funny because each one begins a little clumsy. The first, we start the discussion, the first 2 or 3 minutes, people are kind of reaching for what the problem is. And there's some gaps. And we've kind of gotten to the point where we no longer feel nervous about the gaps. We know, give it a little time, it'll catch fire. And then by about 10 minutes in, everybody's adding things in and they're just filling the chat window with a whole bunch of ideas. So it's worked so well with inside of Pfizer. We haven't been able to share it with anybody because it's kind of working internally on their stuff. And so it's not public information. But now we're going to use the same model starting next Tuesday with 4 of our longtime partner groups, one of which is National Park Service. The others are U.S. Forest Service, Federal Aviation Administration, and 5 gyres, plastics in the ocean. And what we're going to do is 4 sessions every Tuesday in August at 11 Pacific. And these sessions will actually be for 2 hours, well, an hour and a half of the work, and then I'll stick around for another half hour to chit chat with people. But the hour and a half will be two presentations. And so we'll have one each from, a couple of the partner groups. Next week, we're actually going to begin with Brian Hamilton from National Park Service. And our other presenter will be from 5 gyres, Andra, forgotten her last name, but they'll both be presenting they'll do separate sessions. So we'll do 2 half hours. We'll have a whole, 5-minute gap between them. And the cool thing about it, anybody listening to this podcast, if you want to listen in, send us an email. We'll get you the link. You have to be in those 4 groups and graduates of the course to be part of be a builder where you're actually allowed in to make the comments, but anybody can observe. Just got to write to us and explain to us, what you do or why it's relevant. And this will be a chance for the first time for people to see the ABT process in action, to bring in spectators like that. And next week's group, we'll probably have, I'm guessing 30 to 40 people in the first session next week, but I'm sure it will grow with time. And we'll do it for August. And I think we'll probably fire it up again in October. We'll see how that goes. But this is really the grand synthesis in a lot of ways of everything we've been working on for 10 years is to have this model of this social dynamic of everybody working together on the narrative. And the great thing about the ABT is that it's so analytical. It doesn't turn into these opinion sessions. We've never ever had any complaints about somebody dominating or saying you're boring and who knows what. It's just all understood. The ABT gives you this analytical way to break down the narrative and contribute to it. How are you feeling about next week's narrative gym exercise?
I'm very excited about it. It sounds almost like working circles on steroids.
Yeah, it is. You're right. The You're right. The model does sort of originate from what we did with working circles, which was just 5 people doing the same thing. The difference is a bigger group, and it's got that 3-minute presentation at the beginning. That's actually 3 slides. And then it's structured into these 5 elements, which as I said, we've done 11 rounds now. In the beginning, we threw the 5 together, wondering, is this the right progression? Now that we've done 11 times, we're pretty sure it's exactly the 5 right things. You definitely want to start with the problem. And a lot of times in a half-hour discussion, 20 minutes of it will go just to the problem, and that's our basic rule. You can't go further until you really nail the problem. But what happens is once you've got the problem nailed down after 20 minutes, you go to the next thing. What's the ordinary world? By then you've already talked about the ordinary world. So, okay, the ordinary world's this, everybody agrees on that. What's at stake? We already talked about. So the other elements seem to come into play in just getting to the problem. And so the back end kind of goes pretty quickly. Other thoughts on it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, it's fun to watch and be a part of it because, like you were just saying, there's no contentiousness around it. I mean, even whether you agree or disagree with what the ABT is that the person is working on, I think people are so caught up in trying to be helpful and trying to present, a better way to say something, that they it doesn't matter what it is the person's trying to communicate. Even if they disagree with the statement, it's like everyone is so excited and so energized about helping to make it better.
Yeah.
I think that alone is kind of an interesting concept, right? Someone could like get totally involved in making something better around something that maybe they disagree with. And it's like, but they put that aside. Right.
Yeah.
I think there's something to that, Randy, that's you have a way of getting people to maybe communicate about something that they wouldn't normally talk about if they disagreed with an idea.
It's something in that analytical element, and it's baffled us from the very beginning, because when we started in 2015, the first few circles, we basically, it was Jade Lovell helped me really start the first 4 years or so, and she and I kept talking about, we got to get ready for all these personality meltdowns when somebody throws a temper tantrum, who knows what, and some big ego comes in. And it's 7 years later, and a few thousand people have gone through this training. We've never once had any sort of a clash. I mean, it just is, after a while, it began to amaze us. And that's the byproduct of bringing in this more analytical approach. And that's what's so powerful about the ABT, is that it is a bridge between storytelling and more and more I try not to use the word story and storytelling. This is much more about narrative structure, and I try and get people to understand that. And anybody who's saying, oh, he's trying to teach storytelling for scientists, they really haven't read what we're doing. This is not storytelling for scientists. This is narrative principles, the and button, therefore the setup, problem, solution dynamic, which underpins storytelling, but also debate and rhetoric and logic and the scientific method and all these other things. And so universal. Slowly but surely, we're getting that across with a lot of people. And because it's so universal, and it's bringing it from that holistic world into this more particularized, analytical, kind of atomized world that the science world is much better with, more comfortable with. And then let's see, we've got Brian next week will be one of the first ones, one of the 2 first ones. And then I think a week or 2 later will be also Christy Brigham that you mentioned from. So those will be your 2 representatives from National Park Service. And we had her on this podcast way back at the beginning talking about fire season here. And we matched her up with a fellow from Australia and talked about fire season down there. She's tremendous. And she's gotten a lot of mileage out of the ABT, right? You've talked with her a bit about that.
Yeah. And, she talks to the media, she talks to the public, and we have this whole problem with misinformation, right? Or, so she's faced with that, kind of helping people understand, and even people who are disagreeing with what's going on and why it's happening. So she's in a difficult situation to communicate what's happening and how to get people to understand and be more involved. So yeah, she's really applying it in real life.
Yeah. And she's so good with it. And she was great on that episode of the podcast. So we shall see how we go. And, but I want to encourage you to talk to some of the people there at NPS that have heard about ABT stuff, and definitely invite them. Matt will be sending the link out in the next few days. And once you get it, feel free to forward it to them. What will happen is people will join in the session that morning, and then only the people that are on the list for builders will be allowed into the session where they can actually comment, but everybody else can just watch. Mm-hmm. And that will be, I think it'll be really fun. The other thing we came up with is we're we're going to put together a PDF that we'll send to everybody that is your play at home sheet that has got the 5 elements. And so literally as the thing's going on, that's what everybody needs to be doing, is print out that sheet and just sit there and fill in your own version as you're listening to the 3-minute thing, asking yourself, what is the problem here? And then that will help people really jump in. So bit by bit, we're getting there. And you have moved to San Francisco?
I have. Yep. I'm now back on the West Coast. Happy to be here.
You're living in the city or outside the city?
Right in the city, in the Presidio.
Wow. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
That's
I love it.
Yeah. Exciting. Wait, are you from this part of the country?
I'm from Western Washington, so the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But I spent most of my life on the West Coast, and I did the last 7 years in New England, and it's pretty and it's nice, but I'm totally West Coast, so I'm happy to be back.
That's wonderful. And are you changing at all in the role that you're playing with NPS, or same stuff?
No, same stuff. It's a national program, and that's the beauty of, that is being able to work from anywhere in the country, and also, with remote work these days becoming more and more common. It's fantastic. I can move around and
we got to wrap up here, but that's sort of my final comment is, thank goodness. I mean, it's been horrible, the pandemic, but the Zoom world is what I bellyached for 20 to 30 years. I mean, I've always kind of had a vicious side looking at environmentalists traveling around the world on their junkets for all their conferences and saying, well, why can't you do this remote? Can't you do it over a telephone, conference calls? No, we've got to all get together in person, do this. And amount of resources burned up in those things. And I've really burned myself out on travel in all the years of the films that I had and with story circles. And so when this came along and finally the Zoom world sprung up, I think it's just tremendous. And it's been the magical thing for us with the narrative training, which is that I talk in terms of the 3 phases of what we've done. The first 5 years was just low boil, kind of throwing the ABT out there to see if there was something to it. The next 5 was story circles with you guys and lots of other groups. That was medium boil. And now the last 2 years has been this ABT Framework course made possible by the Zoom world, that when it started in the spring of 2020, Matt and I were like, well, let's see if this could possibly work. And boom, overnight, everybody was on board. And now it's tremendous. I think what happened this spring and summer was people got so much burnout from the pandemic and everything that when they finally were allowed to go back outdoors in March and April, and people were kind of more or less declaring the pandemic over, at least for the time being, everybody was relieved to get off of Zoom for a while. But I think that people are going to be ready to get back on. In September, we're launching 4 rounds of the course simultaneously. And it's just turned out to be a godsend for us in terms of how to train folks on this stuff. It works so well. And then with the working circles, as you say, and now the narrative gym. So yay.
And it's so accessible for people.
Yes.
I mean, it's really, and what we're finding too, there was a little bit of burnout with Zoom, but the way your model works, where it's an hour here, an hour there, maybe 90 minutes at the most, but that's what people want.
Yeah.
It's accessible. They can fit it into their daily schedule. It's kind of grab and go, right? It's the Uber.
Well, I mentioned there at the beginning. Yeah, I mentioned the great and wonderful Larry Perez, head of climate stuff there in Fort Collins, and we had him as a guest in the course in probably about the 5th or 6th round. And it was right at the beginning of the Zoom world stuff. And we did the 1-hour session with him. And when it was over with, he was raving to me and saying, oh my God, you guys are using Zoom the right way. And he said, I did a session yesterday. It was 2.5 hours. It was so disorganized. People just sitting there for long gaps, looking through papers and, no structure. A little of that is driven by my training as a filmmaker, because this is the sad thing that didn't happen at the start of the Zoom world. I wish Steven Spielberg could have given a lecture. I'm just thinking this up off the top of my head. In a perfect world, in April of 2020, Steven Spielberg would have gone to the Oval Office and given a lecture to the nation on how to use Zoom, because it's filmmaking. And all the things we learned in film school, I was in the mid 90s, all those basic principles about visual media, people are very visual and their eyes get tired, and you've got to figure out ways to engage. There's so many of these basic rules that I've seen all these little tutorials emerge then with the Zoom world, trying to help people on how to light their thing and getting people to understand that if you don't look good on Zoom, with the lighting and things like that, nobody's listening to anything you're saying. They're all like, ugh. And it's a visual medium. This is what we've been working a lot with the Pfizer folks, getting them to understand that these slides, that you've got to use visuals sparingly, because that really is a burden on the audience. And when you put up a slide with full sentences, they're not listening to anything. They're reading what's on the screen. And it's amazing. We're now changing the culture there, at least within this one group, where now people are sending us their slides as first drafts, and they're so stripped down. They're just single words for cues, and they're not full sentences. And the slides are very much open space and only a little bit of text. And that's really fun to watch that happening. They're getting it on their own, and they're understanding what we're talking about. That's the kind of stuff that should have been explained by some voice of leadership that didn't exist. But it's a shame because I think a lot of that burnout on Zoom happened because people just didn't know how to use the medium, and we're just wearing each other down. God, as we know.
Right.
Oh, well. All right. On that note, thank you so much, Cari, for joining us here on the ABT Time podcast. And you will be there next Tuesday, along with all the other folks, as we start the first ever broader round of the Narrative Gym that anybody can listen in. Just send us an email through the website, and it's going to be fun. And I'm sure it'll be around for a long time to come. So thanks, Cari. And here's to doing more stuff with the National Park Service very soon, and ABT.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Randy. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
Yay. And you too. Thanks. Okay. See everybody next time. Bye.